Eugene Genovese, Authoritarian Thought and Dialectics in Stalinism, the Confederacy, and American Conservatism. For the Marxist, there's perhaps no greater mode of thought than dialectical analysis, the fusion of opposing forces into a positive synthesis. For Eugene Genovese, a historian of the antebellum South, dialectics provided the lifeblood of his thought, research, and work. Genovese's dialectical thought structure gave him unique insights into the American South via his application of Gramscian cultural hegemony theory, which was enriched by his appreciation of the psyche of master and slave. Genovese began his academic career as a Stalinist, revering the strong hand of the Soviet state, which, paradoxically, bound its proletariat in the name of collective welfare. However, Genovese ended his life as an enthusiastic supporter of American conservatism and Catholicism, the religion of his youth. One thing that remained unchanged in the structure of Genovese's thought was his appreciation for an authoritarianism predicated on the moral principle of a model society. The dialectical conception of history stresses the importance of change and continuity over time. Continuity in Genovese's thought was embodied in his authoritarian thought structure, and the change was encapsulated in the varying geopolitical symbols that he used to represent his own authoritarian morality, whether these related to the Soviet state or the American South. Genovese's insight into the mechanics of dialects, their role in shaping ideology, and his ability to interpret the past based on his own worldview demonstrated to academics the importance of viewing master and slave in the American South as ideological agents. The need to fuse the moral authoritarian abstract with the geopolitical concrete was the essence of Genovese, the scholar. It was the insights that he gained from this worldview that enabled him to see how both master and slave projected their own ideologies on the material terrain of the American South. Within academia, Genovese went on to become one of the most notable American historians to brandish the self-appellation Marxist. His work focused on the dialectical nature of slavery in the American South, illustrating the paternalistic morality of the masters and subaltern strategies of the slaves. The two forces struggled for control of the patriarchal cultural framework they both helped craft. Genovese's humanizing of the master class drew the ire of some scholars, while others viewed his work as insightful and penetrating, due to his pioneering application of Antonio Gramsci's cultural hegemony theory to the American South. The creativity involved in applying Gramscian analysis to the South allowed scholars to better appreciate how ideological interests and aspirations of master and slave forged Southern society. However, as the master class of the South lost the Confederacy as an embodiment of their ideals after the Civil War, Genovese lost the Soviet Union as the embodiment of his ideals in 1991. As the decade progressed, Genovese gravitated steadily towards the political faction in U.S. politics that kept a socially conservative mindset, as Confederacy and USSR did, the Republican Party of George W. Bush. By the end of the 1990s, Genovese was residing in Atlanta with his wife and fellow scholar Elizabeth Fox Genovese, another Marxist whose God had failed in the post-Soviet years. The two became enthusiastic supporters of the American political right. One of the last major speeches made by Eugene Genovese was at the 2010 CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, where he utilized the structure of the Stalinist social fascist mode of critique to attack the academic establishment on America's college campuses. Genovese categorized the academic left as totalitarian en masse. Genovese died of heart disease at age 82 in September 2012, leaving behind him the legacy of a man who had a fierce devotion to historical insight, dialect thought, and a socially conservative mindset. Born in May of 1930, Eugene Dominic Genovese grew up in a working-class Italian-American neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. By the age of 15, he had abandoned his family's Catholic beliefs and had become a young Stalinist organizer for the Communist Party USA. Genovese described himself as having a hostile view towards intelligentsia and was generally ignorant of the intellectual uses of Marxism as a mode of critical analysis with the goal of dialectically transcending a capitalist stage of human history. I was an activist and not at all interested in Marxist theory or intellectual work. I hated the intellectual. I was very contemptuous of the whole business and was very single-minded in my commitment. Furthermore, Genovese recalled having no illusions about Soviet humanitarianism and no desire to significantly distance his worldview from Stalinist apologetics. Back then, we believed that in order to produce a model society, one generation would have to suffer. By 1950, during his sophomore year at Brooklyn College, Genovese found himself expelled from the Communist Party for white chauvinism. Genovese stated vaguely, "I zigged when I should have zagged." After his expulsion, Young Genovese flirted with the ideas of being a trade union organizer and journalist, but finding himself dissatisfied following those paths and desiring a deeper understanding of his Stalinist views, he began to pursue a career as a Marxist scholar at Brooklyn College. Genovese trained under Hans Rosenberg, a distinguished historian who had fled Nazi Germany. Rosenberg was said to have been characterized as a caring but demanding taskmaster who labored alongside his overburdened protégés. Genovese went on to study as a graduate student at the University of Columbia. It was there that he began his research on the Slave South. Genovese pursued the study of the slave master class, a research area he had already investigated as an undergraduate and had become his dissertation topic. He heeded his advisor's advice to choose a topic opposed to the Stalinist worldview. In an interview, Genovese recalled, I was a leader in the communist youth, and the farthest I could get from that was the master on the plantation. However, Genovese's appreciation for the authoritarian structure of the Stalinist state and his belief in the ascendancy of the historically oppressed working class energized him to describe master and slave in their own terms. Genovese's dissertation and previous research was compiled in his first publication, The Political Economy of Slavery, where he argued that the ideological, philosophical, and moral values of the slave master class were inseparably woven into the economy of the South. In essence, slavery was not simply a cynical or crude method of exploitation by the masters. Instead, it was a social, political, and economic order forged by the merger of the slave masters' ideals and interests. As with Stalin, Genovese held no soft-hearted illusions about the South. Genovese illustrated the critical importance of overt, arbitrarily violent racism in buttressing the hegemony of the masters. However, Genovese also understood that the members of the master class poured themselves into an institution that sought fundamentally to be morally superior to Northern industrial capitalism. Genovese described slavery not as a mere means to a material end, but as the mode of production from which the slave masters derived meaning. Slavery, while it bound the South economically, granted it the privilege of developing an aristocratic tradition, a disciplined, cohesive ruling class, and a mythology of its own. This was illustrated explicitly in Genovese's chapter, Slave Labor or Free in Southern Factories, which articulated the master class's fear that if proletarian consciousness were instilled in the slaves, the harmony that bound Southern civilization would be mortally endangered. Let our slaves continue where they have been and where they are of immense value. Let them raise from the earth rice, corn, etc., which they are fitted to do, fill our factories and our workshops with our slaves, and we shall have in our midst those whose very existence is in hostile array to our institutions. According to Genovese, the merger of the cultural ideal and economic institution made the South unwilling to embrace industrial capitalism. When the continuation of slavery proved a hindrance to Northern industrial expansion into newly acquired Western territories, the South's fate was largely sealed. As both a dialectically minded Marxist scholar and authoritarian thinker, Genovese's ability to capture the mindset of the master class of the South allowed him to convey slave owners in their own terms to a generation of leftist academics in the 1960s. Following de-Stalinization in the USSR and the Sino-Soviet split, Genovese briefly became infatuated with Maoism, siding with Maoist totalitarian utility over Khrushchev's political and economic moderation. Genovese stated that Mao's path would bring about the long-awaited socialist revolution. Genovese's scholarly accomplishments earned him a seat in the history department at Rutgers University in 1965. However, Genovese gained notoriety for his politics rather than his scholarship. When at a 1965 teach-in, he stated, "I do not fear or regret the impending Viet Cong victory in Vietnam. I welcome it." This statement garnered the attention of the Republican New Jersey gubernatorial candidate who campaigned under the slogan, "Let's get the Reds out of Rutgers." However, greater attention was heaped on Genovese when President Richard Nixon entered the fray, stating, "Academic freedom stops when a scholar advocates victory for the enemy." Genovese stated in 1995 that he had the honor of being the only college professor whom Richard Nixon personally campaigned to get fired. He went on to state that he had had no delusions about the Vietnamese communists fighting for democracy or Ho Chi Minh being analogous to Thomas Jefferson. He had viewed the Vietnam War as being fought on the grounds of national unification, socialism, and the balance of power in Asia. He had thought that any pretense of democracy was hogwash. Genovese recounted, "I said plainly that the winning side would impose a harsh dictatorship and that the only question was, who would do whom?" Genovese continued to support authoritarian or totalitarian regimes that symbolized and solidified his own worldview, as well as brutal Stalinist modes of power. In a 1968 letter to the American Historical Review, Genovese stated, "In irreconcilable confrontations, as Comrade Stalin, who remains dear to some of us for the genuine accomplishments that accompanied his crimes, clearly understood, it is precisely the most admirable, manly, principled, and by their own lights, moral opponents who have to be killed, the others can be frightened or bought." Genovese, ironically or hypocritically, rejected any form of political coercion that would effectively limit academic freedom in the ivory tower. Genovese's support for academic freedom stemmed from his own indebtedness to institutions and mentors who had made his life as a scholar possible through their tolerance of his Stalinist worldview. Genovese stated, "There were a lot of people in the academic world, liberals and conservatives, who did behave very decently towards us, though they criticized our work, of course. They did so in a way that made it clear that our work was to be accepted and respected." Genovese passed this courtesy on to his graduate students, whom he wished to have the same professional opportunities he enjoyed. Furthermore, Genovese apparently did not want to submit himself to the types of authoritarian bondage he valorized in his historical writings and political speeches. In 1971, Genovese stated, "The grim experiences of Russia, China, and other undemocratic socialist countries, whose revolutions and social systems we support in principle, ought to be enough to convince us that one of our major responsibilities is to guarantee that our own movement embody those great and living traditions of free and critical thought, which are the glory of Western civilization, and without which we have nothing to offer the American people." Despite his dismissal of democratic hogwash regarding leftist idealism regarding the Viet Cong, Genovese gained an appreciation for civility and plurality when it applied to himself. If Stalinist show trials were necessary miseries to be endued in forging a higher civilization for the Soviet masses, McCarthyism represented no such benefit for Genovese and his colleagues. Genovese elaborated, "If it had not been for a significant group of prominent scholars who were determined not to return to the McCarthy days, and who used their own influence to fight for a more civilized approach to these questions, it would have been much, much harder for all of us." Genovese's moral and intellectual gymnastics were further demonstrated when he refused to support an initiative for the American Historical Association to demand U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. Members of the initiative, such as Ronald Radosh, recalled their shock and confusion at Genovese's actions. The New Left supporters of the withdrawal resolution, he said, were totalitarians, and he called upon the majority of the members to isolate them and put them down hard once and for all. Conservative members of the AHA cheered as we radicals stood there, speechless. Genovese was not fired from Rutgers due to the controversy he generated. However, by 1967, he left for a teaching position in Canada at Sir George Williams University in Montreal, where he felt his political views would be viewed as less of a hurdle to his career as a scholar. In 1969, he returned to the United States as a faculty member at the University of Rochester. It was during this period that he significantly expanded the scope of his research to focus on the ideology of the slave as well as the master class. What may be Genovese's magnum opus, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made, 1974, was a nearly 1,000-page monograph which described how master and slave dialectically composed the cultural framework and material prosperity of Southern society. If Genovese's description of the patriarchal slave system was tinged with sympathy due to its structural similarities to the Soviet state, his view of the alienated, laboring slave who struggled for freedom was that they foreshadowed Marx's proletariat. Genovese's appreciation for authoritarian methodology and proletarian ascendancy allowed him to describe passionately the hegemonic methodologies of master and slave. The tool Genovese used to synthesize the ideologies of master and slave was Antonio Gramsci's cultural hegemony theory. Co-founder of the Italian Communist Party, Gramsci posited that consent of the oppressed was manufactured by the ruling class, who shaped culture based on its own ideals and interests. The oppressed, in addition to struggling for economic control, struggled for cultural control. The dialectic struggle between oppressed and oppressor took place often subtly over cultural tools of day-to-day life that structured human thought, language, and action. Genovese's application of Gramscian thought to the American South was a groundbreaking scholarly feat. The cultural model upon which the South was predicated was the pre-capitalist patriarchal state. In essence, the authoritarian dynamic of a household was extrapolated to a social model. How master and slave struggled to define patriarchy on their own terms determined the cultural, political, and economic structure of the Old South. The masterclass viewed the plantation as a microcosm of natural order and transcendent harmony embodied in the symbol of the family. The white master was the perpetual father, while the black slave as perpetual child. For the master, the arbitrarily harsh treatment of the slaves was an unfortunate but inevitable fact of their model society. Genovese elaborates. Notwithstanding twinges of conscience, which generally concern the excesses and not the exigencies of the system, the slaveholders increasingly saw themselves as good men who acted in the best interests of their dependent beings and for the prosperity and happiness of the world. The masterclass's belief in paternalism not only rationalized itself as a self-serving socioeconomic hierarchy, but also legitimized masters as moral agents. A goal of the masterclass was to civilize the slaves, that is, to make the slaves' behavior and thinking more in line with the values of the white owners. However, this goal produced an ideological irony. This stemmed from the master's inability to categorize slavery as a teleological or non-teleological mode of thought and life. If the slaves as a group could become civilized or humans capable of responsible independence, slavery as a system would at a point become morally unnecessary. Nevertheless, only by rejecting the teleological vision of the eventuality of black slaves becoming a civilized people could slavery as a perpetual system be justified. While this ideological contradiction hovered, slaves were able to utilize the concept of patriarchy in ways that undermined the foundations of the masterclass's conception of the term. The household dynamic holds that the head of the house is obliged to provide the proper conditions for the cultivation and maturation of the child. Once the slaves understood what tools the masterclass designated for cultivation and maturation, they could use them for their own ends. For example, the slave's ability to navigate the relationship between master and work overseer, slave driver, allowed the slaves to have a role in shaping working conditions. Genovese elaborates, the slaves spoke up, and the master had to listen. There were limits which the slaves understood because they helped set them, beyond which an overseer dared not go. As in the cases of Stalin's democratization of unions or Mao's Cultural Revolution, the masterclass of the Old South was able to buttress its own position at the top of society by scapegoating middle-level officials. Slaves could protest the methods of the overseer in the name of patriarchy and thus have a role in shaping working conditions. At the same time, slaves could indirectly punish an overseer whose methods they disapproved of. Genovese elaborates, no sensible slaveholder wanted a man who could not maintain a certain level of morale among the slaves. Thus the slaves had an opening. They knew it and they seized it, plantation owner A.H. Arrington is quoted as saying, I have this day discharged my overseer, Mr. Brewer. I found so much dissatisfaction amongst the Negroes that I placed under his charge that I could not feel satisfied to continue him in my employment. The ability of the slaves to translate the language of patriarchy in ways that resisted totalizing dehumanization and alienation was successfully embodied in their interpretation of Christianity. Genovese utilizes a classical Marxist understanding of religion to interpret the spirituality of the Old South. He views slave religion as an admirable tool used by the oppressed who yearn for justice. However, Genovese also describes slave religion as a historically stifling opiate. The master's interpretation of Christian teaching was that of hierarchical material order based on their belief in metaphysical principles of racial inequality. Instead, the slaves' interpretation of Christianity leveled hierarchy through their interpretation of biblical moral principle, namely their embracing the idea of the brotherhood of humanity under the fatherhood of God. This conception of metaphysical truth forged a consciousness in slaves that was not that of a subordinate to their masters, but rather an equal, and depending on their ability to follow biblical tenets, a potential superior to their master in the eyes of God. Slaves, therefore, were obliged to judge their master based on standards of good and evil that applied to human beings regardless of race. Furthermore, the shared memory of African culture and common experiences as slaves created a distinct form of Christian worship that allowed slaves to create their own culture dialectically with the social tools provided by Southern patriarchy. Genovese describes the slaves' religion as uniquely black, while at the same time uniquely American, since the white masters' religious Christian denominations were rooted in Europe, resulting in the slaves' religion, in the dialectical sense, being simultaneously itself and other, both separate and together, and of developing a religion within a religion and a nation within a nation. Through Christianity, slaves were able to interpret collectively a set of ideals which could become embodied in slaves' lives, in their congregations, and on the plantations. However, while Christianity provided slaves with a powerful tool that built an independent, dignified, and moral consciousness, It also carried with it pacifying elements that stabilized the master's regime. One crucial stabilizing element stemmed from the slaves' African heritage. A determined revolutionary consciousness is often kindled by urgent, apocalyptic, utopian ideals that transcend time, place, and humanity. This mode of radical thought requires a teleological conception of time. However, the West African heritage of many slaves did not view time as having a starting and end point, but rather a cyclical, eternal nature. According to Genovese, this moderated the revolutionary potential of apocalyptic biblical texts, like the books of Daniel and Revelation. Another dampening element that stemmed from Christianity was the very conception of human brotherhood that brought the slaves human dignity in the first place. Simply put, if the master could not be properly dehumanized, he was harder to hate and wish death upon. Genovese quotes a typical bedtime prayer that slaves taught their children. "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Bless Pappy, bless Mammy, bless Master and Missy, and bless me. Amen." In essence, Christianity provided the slaves with a useful defensive weapon against slavery's attack on the slave's human dignity, but provided a poor offensive weapon for the slaves to wield against the hegemony of the slave system and its masters. However, what defined the synthetic nature of the patriarchal structure of the Old South, more than anything, was fact that, despite the unequal and brutal antagonisms that manifested themselves on overt and subtle levels, both master and slave shared a sense of accomplishment in having their labor reflected in the plantation. Genovese quotes an ex-slave's grief over the burning of plantations during the Civil War. "It makes my innards hurt to see fire attached to something that cost us niggers so much labor and honest sweat." Roll, Jordan, Roll earned Genovese critical acclaim, winning him the prestigious Bancroft Prize in 1974. Nevertheless, not all of Genovese's peers responded favorably to Roll, Jordan, Roll. Genovese's inability to portray his slave protagonists according to the preferred Nietzschean trope of an ambitious, willful, guilt-free historical agent drew criticism. Critique lay heavily on Genovese's positing of Southern paternalism as a binding force between master and slave. In his book review essay entitled Aunt Jemima in Dialectics, James D. Anderson of the University of Illinois railed against Genovese for his failure to intersect paternalism and genocidal violence in his portrayal of the slave South. Interestingly, Anderson neglects to mention the extent that Genovese's unflinching Stalinism may have caused him to neglect the prospect of genocide in his research. Notably, Anderson also charges that Genovese portrayed the masterclass as fundamentally more cerebral than their slave counterparts. One wonders if Genovese realizes his tendency to approach whites as thinking human beings and blacks as feeling human beings. Not surprisingly, Genovese's 1979 book, From Rebellion to Revolution, Afro-American Slave Revolts in the Making of the Modern World, examined the economic and political conditions conducive to slave revolts, such as those led by Toussaint and his Haitian Jacobins. Toussaint and his forces had the benefit of being on France's colonial periphery during the French Revolution. This allowed them to have access to Jacobinite ideology, which could be wielded effectively against a colonial masterclass that was dependent on stability in the French imperial center. Genovese argues that had the Southern slaves in the United States been afforded similar socio-historical circumstances, violent slave revolts would have been much more frequent and intense. Genovese states, "The wonder, then, is not that the United States had fewer and smaller revolts than some countries did, but that they had any at all. That they did in whatever proportions demonstrated to the world the impossibility of crushing the slave's rebellious spirit." As the 1980s progressed, Genovese maintained his relationship with the University of Rochester. However, tensions within the history department caused Genovese to spend time teaching at various universities across the country, including SUNY Binghamton, with his wife, Marxist feminist historian Elizabeth Fox Genovese. In 1983, the two collaborated on Fruits of Merchant Capital, Slavery and Bourgeois Property and the Rise and Expansion of Capitalism, in which they analyze the development of capitalism in Europe and the unique historical character of the antebellum South. As the decade continued, the Soviet Empire began to unravel. For Genovese, a scholar whose conservative Hegelianism saw human historical progression embodied in state structures, the ideological ground beneath him crumbled. As the early 1990s progressed, Genovese's Marxism became vaguer and less pronounced, and his praise for American conservative tradition grew more distinct and forceful. Genovese's writing shifted back to analyzing the worldview of the masterclass of the Old South in increasingly sympathetic tones. Still writing under the profession of Marxism, but now free of admiration for Stalin, Genovese wrote The Southern Front, History and Politics in the Culture War. In it, he continues to demonstrate his appreciation for the importance of Gramscian cultural hegemony. Genovese argues that cultural tendencies of radical democracy, utopianism, and academic multiculturalism must be countered with values analogous to Genovese's esoteric, culturally conservative Marxism. He praises the legacy of American slaveholders as a bulwark against the radical democracy he readily associated with Jacobin terror, which, in Genovese's post-Stalinist years, is a pejorative. Ironically, Genovese attacks liberal Christian academics like Cornel West for jettisoning the primacy of Christian dogmas, such as the divinity of Christ and Trinitarian theology. The irony of this stems from the fact that Genovese has clearly jettisoned many crucial tenets of his pseudo-religion, Marxism, in the very book in which he is attacking the spiritual confusion of others. For example, in his introduction, Genovese largely dismisses the importance of the Marxist view of an economic base producing a cultural superstructure. In later chapters, he goes on to state that he rejects Marx's notion that the destruction of class exploitation will liberate human beings. If Genovese rejects in principle the ends of radical democracy, the base superstructure mode of analysis, and communist idealism of his own pseudo-religion, then his criticism of Cornel West seems hypocritical, or at the very least not self-aware. Although it is clear that Genovese saw the morally and intellectually hampering effect of academic dogmatism, which ensnared him for much of his career. Genovese's dilemma appears to stem from the fact that, during his decades as a Stalinist, his understanding of the concepts of Marxist thought, the Soviet state, and the methodologies of Stalin seemed to be interwoven to the point of being indistinguishable. The breakdown of one of these elements mortally wounded the others. This sentiment was articulated in the final chapter of The Southern Front, entitled The Question. This essay, which was also published in the summer 1994 issue of Dissent magazine, was presented as a provocative call to the left to engage in critical re-examination of their terminologies, academic stances, and geopolitical sympathies. However, if Genovese had given up on his Marxist academic tribalism, he certainly did not abandon his Stalinist modes of analysis and categorization. Genovese begins by stating he was fully aware, from the beginning of his life as a Stalinist, of the brutal nature and scope of human misery that the Stalinist program brought. He then posits that Marxism and the concept of human liberation in general are essentially pre-forms of Stalinism. Genovese then moves to broadly categorize the left en masse as members of a culturally caustic pro-Soviet team that is stained with the blood of the victims of Stalinistic regimes. This illustrates Genovese becoming increasingly remorseful for his inhumane support for Stalinist brutality from the comfort of the American liberal ivory tower. The continuing structural similarities between Genovese's and Stalin's thought can be seen in the way Stalin presented himself and his policies as natural extensions of Marx's writings and vision for human emancipation. Unable to properly determine which elements in the Soviet Union were antagonistic to his interests, Stalin simply engaged in general two-dimensional categorizations of the groups of people as enemies, such as the kulaks, upon whom he then, directly and indirectly, poured his wrath. Finally, Stalin categorized rival leftists as being in league with Nazi totalitarian tyranny. Genovese may have intentionally been using Stalinist thought structure dialectically to undermine the Stalinist tendencies he saw in the academic left. Shortly after The Question was published, Genovese was quoted in Time magazine as stating that the communist movement was dead and socialism finished. By 1995, Elizabeth Fox Genovese had joined the Catholic Church. Not long after her conversion, Genovese began accompanying her to Mass. Always ideologically conservative, Genovese was said to pay close attention to how accurately church sermons followed doctrinal teachings of the Catholic Church. Genovese related sympathetically to his wife's embracing of the hierarchical authoritarian structure of the Catholic Church. When the time came for Betsy to enter the church, she had no problem with its structure, which she had studied thoroughly long before her conversion. Liberal and progressive religion held no attractions. Genovese and his wife were remarried in the Catholic Church. At the service, Genovese made his decision to return to the faith of his childhood. Not long after his conversion, Genovese became a Catholic apologist for conservative social, political, and economic aims. Genovese was able to maintain his love of authoritarian hierarchy, teleological thinking, abstract thought, and moral clarity via the Catholic Church. This is interesting, considering the Soviet state drew its hierarchical structure from the Russian Orthodox Church, which was nearly identical to the Catholic Church pyramid-like organizational composition. As an avowed conservative of the right from the late 90s until his death in 2012, Genovese continued to write on the culture and consciousness of slave masters in the Old South. Having lost the Soviet Union, Genovese looked to those with whom he identified from his research and embraced the modern-day successor to their ideology, the American political right. While economically and religiously adverse to the Soviet Union, the American political right had structural similarities when it came to having a clear moral code unhampered by progressive relativism, as well as a belief in a strong nation-state. Furthermore, his final monograph, co-authored with his wife, Fatal Deception, Slaveholding Paternalism in the Old South, discussed how slave masters utilized European socialist discourse to categorize Northern industrial labor as a more sinister form of slavery than the pre-capitalist form of slavery practiced in the South. However, Genovese's twilight years may best be remembered for his speech at the 2010 Conservative Political Action Conference. In a surreal moment, Genovese picked up the rhetorical sword that Richard Nixon had used against him 4 decades earlier. Genovese, who had earlier supported and profited from academic freedom, now called on the U.S. government to defund colleges filled with totalitarian faculty that undermined the freedom and culture of America. Genovese's powerful scholarship and rigid political views demanded attention from both his adherents and naysayers. However, despite his overbearing or brutal political attitudes, Genovese was a scholar whose Gramscian analytical creativity, as well as his deep affinity for dialectical compositions of authoritarianism and populism, gave him profoundly meaningful insights into the minds of master and slave. It is for this reason that historians and Marxist thinkers alike are indebted to Genovese for his lifetime of powerful scholarship made possible by his political eccentricities. Bibliography: Anderson, James D. Aunt Jemima and Dialectics, Genovese on Slave Culture, the Journal of Negro History. Vol. 61 No. 1 Jan 1976. Bauerlein Mark on Eugene Genovese. The Chronicle on Higher Education. September 28, 2012 link. Beatham, David. Marxist in Face of Fascism. Writings by Marxists on Fascism from the Interwar. Period. Barnes & Noble Books, 1984. CPAC 2010 Eugene Genovese's speech. Link. Uploaded on June 28, 2010. Access to Deck 8, 2012. Genovese, Eugene. From Rebellion to Revolution. Afro-American Revolts in the Making of the Modern World. Louisiana State University Press, 1979. Genovese, Eugene. Nature and Grace, Voices Online Edition. Vol. No. 2 Pentecost. 2009 link. Genovese, Eugene. The Political Economy of Slavery. Studies in the Economy and Society of the Slave South. New York Pantheon Books, 1961-1964, 1965. Genovese, Eugene. The Southern Front, History and Politics and Culture War. Columbia, University of Missouri Press, 1995. Genovese, Eugene. Roll, Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made. New York Vintage. Books, 1972. Genovese, Eugene. Fox Genovese, Elizabeth. Fatal Self-Deception. Slaveholding Paternalism in the Old South. Cambridge University Press, 2011. Genovese, Eugene. Radosh Ronald. An Interview with Eugene Genovese, The Rise of a Marxist Historian, Changeville. 10 No. 10, November 1978. Gramsci Antonio, The Intellectuals, Prison Notebooks. New York International Publishers, 1999. Howard, Victor B. Review of Fruits of Merchant Capital, Slavery and Bourgeois Property in the Rise and Expansion of Capitalism by Elizabeth Fox Genovese, Eugene D. Genovese, Journal of Social History, Vol. 18 No. 3 Spring 1985. Phelps, Christopher. What Genovese Knew and When, Solidarity Webzine. Link. Radosh Ronald, a historian taught by history, Eugene D. Genovese, 1930-2012. The Weekly Standard. OCT 15, 2012, Vol. 18 No. 05. Roper, John Herbert. Marxing Through Georgia. Eugene Genovese and Radical Historiography for the Region. The Southern Front. History and Politics in the Cultural War by Eugene Dominic Genovese. The Georgia Historical Quarterly, Vol. 80 No. 1 Spring 1996. Woo, Elaine. Eugene Genovese dies at 82, leftist historian turned conservative, Los Angeles.